In a village frozen by winter, where every branch lay lifeless, a small garden suddenly bloomed, but the flowers were redder than blood. When Miss Marple caught the scent of something far older than perfume, she knew some secrets were still breathing beneath the soil. The snow had fallen thick and early that year, cloaking the village of St. Mary-Me in a muffled white quietude. Most gardens, so vibrant in summer, now lay dormant, their beds asleep beneath frost and memory. But it was the Blackmore estate, a long-abandoned property at the edge of the village, that gave rise to an incident so peculiar it would be discussed in low voices for days to come. It was a boy from the rectory, misbehaving as boys do, who scaled the crumbling sidewall and landed awkwardly in what had once been a rose garden. There, between brittle hedge and frozen earth, his eye caught something quite impossible. Amidst the skeletal remains of last summer's brambles stood a single white rose in full bloom, pristine, upright, and utterly untouched by winter's grip. Word traveled quickly, as such things tend to do. The child's mother, summoned in haste, could make neither sense nor excuse for the flower's presence. Yet there it stood, its petals untouched by frost, its stem alive in defiance of the season. Some muttered about warmth rising from underground springs. Others, with more color in their imagination, spoke of spirits unable to rest. But above all else, there was a feeling that something had stirred, a memory perhaps, or a secret better left untouched. The rose, though silent, spoke louder than words, and somewhere not far from the Blackmore garden, Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out upon the snow. The next morning, despite the biting chill, villagers began to appear at the gate of the old Blackmore house, not in great numbers, but in the slow, accumulating way that small communities assemble around peculiarities. Mr. Ellison from the grocer's came to see for himself, followed shortly by Mrs. Featherstone, who had always claimed roses had moods. Even the vicar, after some persuasion from his wife, made the short walk with a pair of binoculars and a cautiously neutral expression. Theories bloomed more abundantly than the rose itself. One elderly woman wrapped in a coat older than the war insisted the flower was a sign that Felicity Blackmore had unfinished business. A younger man suggested it was an unusual graft that had somehow adapted to the cold. The suggestion was met with the sort of silence that generally follows science when superstition has already taken root. Felicity Blackmore had died 10 years earlier, without fuss or family. A quiet fall in the garden, they'd said, no scandal, only sorrow. Yet the bloom now stood on the very spot where she had been found. Conversation turned, as it often does, to remembrance. Old stories resurfaced about how Felicity once swore that her roses would outlast her. Some chuckled at the romanticism of it. Others looked towards the house with tight-lipped reserve. At the window of her parlor, Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. She had once seen Felicity Blackmore walking through that garden, head held high, hand gloved in earth, a woman who knew how to bury things well and deep. It was Mr. Sims who fell next, not in the poetic sense, but in the plain collapsing sense of a man whose body has met something his mind cannot accept. Formerly Felicity Blackmore's devoted gardener, Sims had kept to himself in the years since her death. He lived above the hardware shop now, his hands still stained with memory, his words fewer with each passing winter. When he was told of the rose casually, almost as a matter of local curiosity, his countenance changed in an instant. The color drained from his cheeks, and the mug in his hand fell with a hollow clatter to the floor. Muttering something unintelligible, he hurried out of the shop and made his way, unsteady but swift, to the garden he had not entered in 10 long years. The villagers watched as he passed, his coat flapping like a loose curtain in the wind. Upon reaching the flower, he stopped, dropped to his knees, and whispered. She said it would return. And then, quite without ceremony, he collapsed sideways into the snow, his face turned towards the bloom. They carried him to the doctor's rooms, where he later insisted he had been simply lated. But those who heard the whisper repeated it more than once, as people do when they don't understand, but feel they ought to. Miss Marple, on hearing the tale, did not smile. She remembered Mr. Sims well, loyal, discreet, and deeply superstitious, and she could not help but think it strange that the rose had bloomed, not merely where Felicity had died, but where something far older might have been planted. In the stillness of her parlor, Miss Marple reflected not merely on the rose, but on the farewell that had followed Felicity Blackmore's passing. It had been, even at the time, an odd affair. The funeral had been brief, attended by only a small smattering of villagers. No relatives had arrived, no cousin from Bath, no nephew from London, despite whispered claims that Felicity had a living heir somewhere abroad. The doctor's certificate had come quickly. Cardiac failure due to exertion, if she recalled correctly. Miss Marple had thought it rather too tidy, particularly for a woman known for a sturdy constitution and iron will, but at the time there had been no reason to question it. The will, too, had been disappointingly conventional. The house left to a charitable trust, which had subsequently collapsed, leaving the property to sleep under ivy and shadow. And yet now, with the return of the rose, that tidy conclusion seemed less assured. Things improperly buried had a way of growing back, often in unexpected forms. Miss Marple reached for her diary from 10 years past, a habit she had kept not for vanity, but for precision. There it was. The entry marked 2 days after the funeral. Called on the solicitor. Felt rushed. No presence of nephew. The note stirred something. Attention not quite memory, and not quite instinct. Outside the wind rustled through the bare hedges. Miss Marple rose and walked to her bookcase, where pressed within an old gardening volume lay a flower, once plucked from Felicity's garden. She had kept it without knowing why. The rose, once vibrant, had faded over the years to a pale ivory, delicate as breath. Yet its structure remained intact, its petals paper-thin, but obediently arrayed in quiet defiance of time. Miss Marple held the bloom gently between her fingers and compared it to the descriptions of the flower in the Blackmore garden. A living white rose said to be larger, almost luminescent with a faint blush of cream at the edges. She turned to her reference book, a volume gifted to her by Colonel Melchett's wife years ago, and flipped carefully through the colored plates. Her eye caught upon a page depicting rare hybrids, roses not commonly found in English gardens. One in particular stood out. Rosa albus mirabilis, a French-bred hybrid known for its capacity to bloom unexpectedly in cold climates, but never cultivated widely. The pressed flower was clearly not of that breed, which meant that the rose blooming now, the one in Felicity's garden, had been introduced after her death. It had not survived 10 winters. It had been planted. Miss Marple folded the diary shut. This was no marvel of nature. This was a message, and someone, she suspected, had waited a very long time for it to be seen. 10 days after the appearance of the inexplicable white rose, a letter arrived at the post office bearing foreign stamps and bold masculine handwriting. It announced without ceremony the return of Mr. Louis Blackmore, the sole surviving heir of the late Felicity Blackmore and rightful claimant to the long-silent estate. He arrived not with pomp, but with quiet authority, stepping down from a hired motor car in a well-cut coat and foreign tan gloves. His accent bore traces of the Mediterranean, softened by an education that was unmistakably English. He spoke little, yet carried himself with the calm entitlement of a man certain of his station. Those who had known the boy he once was found little to recognize in the man he had become. The house, uninhabited for nearly a decade, stood in weary silence, its windows clouded, its gates half sunken, and its gardens overrun with moss and bramble. It did not greet him. It merely tolerated his return. Villagers watched from a distance as the doors were unbolted and curtains drawn. Among them, Miss Marple observed, not with suspicion, but with that particular shade of interest she reserved for things that returned uninvited, for there was something too well-timed in his arrival, too neatly coinciding with a flower that should not have bloomed. And though she did not yet know what to suspect, Miss Marple had long since learned that coincidence, in her experience, was merely the curtain behind which motive liked to hide. Mr. Blackmore did not come alone. By his side stood a woman, slight of frame, with features both delicate and drawn, and eyes that held a quiet alarm, as though perpetually bracing for a voice raised in anger or a shadow crossing a window. He introduced her quite informally as his fiancée, Miss Deline Morrow, a name unfamiliar to the village, yet spoken with the pride of possession rather than affection. She smiled when required and remained silent when not. Her French was unmistakable. her English fluid but hesitant, like someone performing from a memorized script. She wore gloves indoors even when the fire was lit, and seemed to glance over her shoulder at nothing in particular. The villagers, ever generous in their judgments, whispered of foreign manners and delicate nerves. Some suggested romantic tragedy, others inherited instability. Miss Marple, when introduced, offered only a gentle smile and a warm comment about the roses in Provence. The young woman palled almost imperceptibly, her hand brushing her necklace in what might have been a reflex or a sign. In the days that followed, Miss Morrow was seen walking alone near the perimeter of the garden, but never stepping beyond its overgrown edge. Her gaze would rest on the white rose, but only briefly, as though it had spoken her name in a language she had tried to forget. Miss Marple took note of such things, especially of those who pretended not to recognize something. They clearly remembered. The matter of the house, legally speaking, should have been straightforward. The original will, drawn in Felicity Blackmore's own neat hand and witnessed by 2 reputable parishioners, had been filed by the village solicitor, Mr. Pendlebury, shortly after her death. It had stated that the property and contents were to pass to her nephew Louis upon his 25th birthday, or to the Crown should he fail to return by then. Yet when Mr. Pendlebury, summoned by the new arrival, dutifully opened the strong box where such documents had been kept, the will was not to be found. Letters remained, receipts, a church donation, but of the will there was no trace. Mr. Pendlebury, a man of considerable fastidiousness and even greater pride, was more than a little rattled. He offered explanations ranging from misfiling to moths, but none satisfied the mutterings that soon stirred in the post office, the greengrocer's, and beneath the hair-dryer at Mrs. Latimer's salon. Had the will ever existed at all? Was it possible that Felicity had changed her mind? Or had someone quite deliberately ensured its disappearance in time for Louis's return? Miss Marple, listening to the rumors as one listens to distant thunder, remembered the haste with which the estate had been closed, and how little fuss had been made at the time. She also remembered that Felicity Blackmore had trusted very few people, and kept the things she feared not in safes, but in soil. In keeping with village civility, Miss Marple called upon the house one afternoon with a basket of preserves and a perfectly folded note expressing neighborly welcome. She was invited in, offered tea, and seated opposite the young fiancée, who sat with her hands wrapped tightly around a teacup that had long since cooled. Conversation was polite, exchanges about weather, the state of the hedge, and the difficulties of restoring old houses. Louis spoke in broad statements, while Deline nodded agreeably, though her eyes seldom lifted from her saucer. It was during a gentle recollection of Felicity's prized flower beds that Miss Marple remarked quite innocently that her roses had once been the envy of the county, especially the whites, she added softly, though they were never known to winter well. At that, the girl's teacup rattled against its saucer with the faintest tremor. She quickly excused herself under the pretense of a draught. Louis, brushing aside the moment with a vague mention of nerves, offered no elaboration, but Miss Marple noted the pallor that had overtaken the girl's face, and how her hand had reached again to her necklace, as though it offered some comfort. Later, walking home past the rose-laden fence, Miss Marple pondered not what the girl had said, but what she had carefully not said. She had seen grief before. She had seen deception. But it was fear genuine, bone-deep fear, that had passed through the room like a chill. And fear in Miss Marple's experience was often the truest confession. It was Mrs. Wetherbe, the vicar's wife, who mentioned it without intending to be significant. Over seed cake and lukewarm coffee, she recalled a conversation with Felicity from years past, one of those half-memories that emerged with the peculiar clarity of hindsight. She said something rather curious, you know, that the truth would stay buried beneath what's living. I remember thinking it was poetry, or possibly a dig at someone. Miss Marple smiled gently, but did not forget the remark. Beneath what's living. The phrase lingered not as verse, but as instruction. That very night, in the still hours, when frost was firm on the ground, a light glimmered faintly near the Blackmore garden. A shape moved slowly across the overgrown path, carrying something long and slender. The sound of earth being broken, carefully, quietly, did not carry far. But for those who listened, who remembered odd funerals and stranger flowers, It was louder than bells. And in her parlor, Miss Marple looked out across the lawn, her knitting idle in her lap. There were secrets, she thought, that no amount of time could keep buried. And some hands, though unfamiliar, always returned to dig where the truth had once been sown. It was the boy from the bakery who raised the alarm. He had been sent round with a fresh loaf, and seeing the door of the greenhouse ajar, ventured inside in the hope of mischief. What he found instead silenced even his overworked imagination. Mr. Sims sprawled upon the greenhouse floor, his limbs rigid, the skin about his mouth faintly discolored. Pots lay shattered beside him, their soil scattered like the remnants of a struggle. In one lifeless hand were rose petals, white with a whisper of cream, crushed as though clenched in a final effort to hold something back. In the other was nothing. The air inside the structure was heavy with damp, though not unpleasant, and the faintest trace of something sharp lingered, like old perfume corrupted. The constable, called with suitable haste, noted no immediate signs of violence. The villagers murmured of heart failure, stress, a fall perhaps. The boy was sent home, pale and quiet, and the door was shut once more. Miss Marple, hearing of it from the butcher's daughter, said very little, but she asked casually whether the petals had been fresh or dried. The girl, surprised by the question, replied that they were soft and wet. Later at her parlor table, Miss Marple pressed her fingers together thoughtfully. One did not crush fresh rose petals in one's hand without purpose. Mr. Sims, in his final moment, had been trying to send a message, and someone, she suspected, had been close enough to stop him from finishing it. Mr. Pendlebury, the solicitor, had kept Felicity Blackmore's house sealed for a decade, honoring her wishes and guarding its contents with dutiful solemnity. But with Louis Blackmore now in residence, access to the old rooms had resumed, among them the conservatory and adjacent tool shed, where Felicity had once distilled her own rose water from petals grown in the eastern beds. It was the new housekeeper, brought in to tidy and restore, who noticed that the small locked cabinet, tucked beneath the potting bench, had been forced open. The contents had been disturbed, though it required a sharp eye to see as much. One bottle in particular, a squat glass vial with a faded label, was absent altogether. Its name, almost ilegible, referred to extractum rosae albiemi, a highly concentrated essence known to be pleasant in aroma, but dangerously toxic in sufficient quantity. When asked, the housekeeper insisted she had not opened the cabinet, nor had she seen any key. Louis, when informed, dismissed the matter as unimportant. Old gardening oils and dust, he said, waving a hand. Nothing to worry over. But Miss Marple did worry. She recalled that Felicity had once spoken of that very extract, boasting of its potency and cautioning a young niece never to touch it. The stuff had been kept under lock for good reason. Now it was gone, and its absence, paired with a dead man holding crushed petals, formed a symmetry far too elegant to be accidental. The doctor, when pressed, declared the death natural. His tone bore the fatigued certainty of a man who has seen too many winters, and prefers neatness over disruption. "A weak heart," he said. "A man of that age, under stress." Yet Miss Marple was unconvinced. She had known Mr. Sims in his younger years, a man of firm stride and strong back. He had aged certainly, but not feebly. And then there was the matter of his collapse at the sight of the rose. The whisper. She said it would return. And now this sudden silent death. No note had been found. No sign of intention. Only the petals clenched in final protest. Moreover, there were details too carefully untidy. A missing vial. A cabinet opened without damage to the hinges. The kind of subtle disarray Miss Marple had long ago learned to trust more than the most polished alibi. The villagers accepted the doctor's word without argument, content to fold the death into the fabric of their quiet days. But Miss Marple did not. She understood that certain poisons mimicked frailty too well, and when guilt desired silence without suspicion, it often turned to the kinds of toxins that left no visible trace, only a quiet corpse and a trail swiftly swept clean. Miss Marple took her questions not to the constable, but to Mr. Bloxam, the village chemist, whose quiet knowledge of both legitimate remedies and their darker cousins had served St. Maryme for decades. Under the guise of discussing rose ailments, blight, wilt, and aphid infestations, she inquired after the preparation and potency of Felicity's infamous rose extract. Mr. Bloxam, wiping his spectacles and squinting at the shelves behind him, confirmed that such an extract, if pure and undiluted, would be extraordinarily toxic. Ingestion, even in small amounts, could cause paralysis of the respiratory system, or more often, what would appear to be heart failure. And if someone wished to disguise it as a natural decline, she asked, her tone light. He considered. Well, if mixed carefully, say diluted with herbal tinctures, it would take a very discerning doctor to know the difference, and most wouldn't look twice. A respectable death, you understand? She did understand. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked one more thing, whether a man such as Mr. Sims might accidentally consume such a substance by misplacing it for tea or tonic. Mr. Bloxam looked puzzled. Unlikely. It's bitter. Unmistakably so. You'd have to be tricked or already too weak to protest. Miss Marple thanked him and returned home, her thoughts ordered like the vials on the apothecary shelf. The death had not been a tragedy of chance. It had been administered, masked, and delivered with precision. And someone, she thought, had measured that dose with a careful and determined hand. Rumor, like ivy, rarely needed encouragement to flourish in St. Mary, Maine. Within days of the gardener's death, Mrs. Porter, the cook at the vicarage, shared with her sister-in-law a curious story relayed by the maid recently employed at Blackmore House. According to the girl, she had gone into the drawing-room late one evening to clear the tea tray and had found Miss Morrow alone, crouched before the hearth. The fire was high, far too high for the time of year, and the fiancé was feeding it with something that flared bright before turning to ash. Papers, the maid believed, thin, aged papers. When asked what she had done, the maid replied that she had pretended not to see. She looked so frightened, like she was burning a ghost. The story might have gone no further had the maid not also mentioned a faint scent, floral but sharp, lingering in the room afterwards. Like old roses in vinegar, she had said, wrinkling her nose. Miss Marple, hearing this second-hand and stitched together by gossip, understood the significance. For someone to destroy documents at night, and so soon before a man's sudden death, was no coincidence. She thought again of the young woman's reaction to roses and her quiet glances towards the garden, and she began to wonder, was it guilt in the girl's eyes, or fear of what others might still uncover? Miss Marple, never one to overlook a smoldering hearth, paid a discreet call the next day, under the pretext of returning a borrowed pamphlet on invasive weeds. While Louis answered the door with customary coolness, it was Deline who seemed less composed, her hands trembling slightly as she took the pages. Before leaving, Miss Marple casually inquired whether the drawing-room fire might be relit. It was, she claimed, a particular comfort on gray days. Louis declined. The hearth had been cleared, but Miss Marple had noted a small brass bin beside the grate used for ash. Inside, still warm, lay a few unburnt edges, scraps too damp or curled to vanish entirely. One bore a flourish of ink and half a name. Isity BL, just above it another corner of the page had survived enough to reveal a closing line. Yours always, She said nothing. Back in her parlor, she laid the fragments on blotting paper and gently pressed them flat. The initials were not unfamiliar. She had seen them once before in a church registry, connected to a name whispered during the war and quickly forgotten. Now it seemed they had returned in flame and silence, and someone, she feared, was burning more than just old letters. They were trying to burn the past itself. The scorched edges of the letter fragment Miss Marple had salvaged from the hearth still bore the faint scent of smoke and lavender polish. Pressed flat beneath the weight of her gardening encyclopedia, the paper surrendered a few legible words. The garden that will bloom again once truth is restored. It was not mere sentiment. Miss Marple recognized the tone at once. It was the language of confession disguised as poetry, the kind of phrase one writes when intending not only to be remembered but to be rediscovered. The handwriting elegant and looping bore similarities to other samples in Felicity's known correspondence. Yet this letter was not signed F.B., as one might expect. Instead, it ended with a simple E.H., the same initials that had once graced a wedding announcement in the parish register, then crossed out in ink by the vicar himself. She thought again of the white rose, an unnatural bloom, out of season and out of time. A message, yes, but from whom? And to whom? Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes distant. Letters rarely survived fire by accident. Someone, perhaps in panic, had destroyed what they feared would be read, and overlooked what they believed could not. But the truth, she knew, always left corners that curled but refused to burn. The matter of the photograph came quite by chance. Miss Marple, while assisting Mrs. Phillips with a church bazaar stall of second-hand books and albums, came upon a small cracked leather folio, the kind favored for family portraits before war rationing had replaced sentiment with austerity. Tucked inside, half hidden by a page of dried forget-me-nots, was a photograph of Felicity Blackmore, younger but recognizable, standing in what was unmistakably the rear garden of Blackmore House. Beside her a child, perhaps 6 or 7, held her hand, face turned slightly toward the camera, eyes dark and unreadable, and just behind them a tall man with his arm resting lightly on Felicity's shoulder. The man's face had been deliberately scratched away, not clumsily, but with methodical care, the sort performed by someone both resolute and intimately acquainted with the image. Miss Marple studied the child's features. They were not Louiswise's, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. There was no trace of Blackmore blood that she could detect, and the clothes, she noted, were not those of a niece or ward, but of someone kept close and quiet, cherished privately perhaps, but not acknowledged publicly. She took the folio, paid 6 pence, and offered no explanation. Later, by her window, she ran a gloved finger over the scored paper where the man's face had once been. Some ghosts, she reflected, are erased not because they are absent, but because they are remembered too well. There remained in St. Mary Me a few, whose memory stretched back as far as Miss Marple's own, among them Nurse Oli, now retired, who had once been summoned to the Blackmore house in the final years of Felicity's life. Under the pretense of a call regarding shared acquaintances, Miss Marple paid her a visit. Over lukewarm tea and buttered scone, the conversation turned gently to the past. Nurse Oli, while courteous, was reserved. She admitted only that Felicity had suffered from what was once called nervous strain, and that the strain had not been wholly unfounded. There had been loss, she said. Family troubles best left undisturbed in grief that if voiced aloud might have endangered reputations. She declined to elaborate, citing professional ethics. A nurse's silence, you see, she added mildly, does not end with retirement. But she did let slip one curious remark. Felicity, she recalled, had once insisted quite forcefully that what is planted must be protected. Miss Marple, ever careful not to overstep, pressed no further. But as she walked home, that phrase circled her thoughts with quiet insistence. There were, she knew, different kinds of planting. Some bore fruit, some bore thorns, and some were meant never to be dug up. Though the matter had long since faded from the daily gossip of the village, Miss Marple's inquiries reawakened an old curiosity regarding Felicity Blackmore's former maid, Clara. Clara had been a silent presence in the Blackmore household for nearly a decade, known for her plain features and unobtrusive manner. Then, without warning, she had vanished. No notice had been given. No trunk had been collected from the railway station. It was said she left in the night, though no one could confirm whether she had walked or been driven. Mrs. Grayson, who had once done washing for the Blackmores, remembered it well. There was a quarrel, she confided, though I only heard it through the back window. Voices raised, and then nothing. She had expected the girl to reappear, to send word, to collect wages at the very least. But Clara was never seen again. Curiously, it had happened just 3 days before Felicity herself was found dead in the garden. Some said Clara had taken something with her, papers perhaps, or jewelry. Others whispered of scandal, though no one dared specify what sort. Miss Marple considered the silence. For a maid to vanish in such fashion suggested not flight, but removal, either forced or voluntary, yet always fearful. She thought of the child in the photograph, the scratched-out face, the letter that spoke of truth beneath the soil, and she wondered, had Clara taken something away, or had she left something behind? Miss Marple was not in the habit of browsing pawn shops, but on a tip from young Tommy Latimer, who claimed to have seen something odd in the window of Mr. Elworthy's second-hand shop. She ventured discreetly into the establishment. There, among an assortment of trinkets and mismatched brooches, lay a silver locket of modest design. What caught her eye was not its form, but the engraving within. 2 names, Eleanor and Hope. The locket bore signs of age, yet it had been polished with care. The clasp was delicate, the kind a woman might wear close to the skin for years, without removing. Inside, beneath the glass panes, were no photographs, only dried petals so finely pressed they had fused into a single flattened mass. Rose petals, by the look of them, though of what kind she could not yet be sure. She inquired as to the seller. Mr. Elworthy, who was not in the habit of questioning origins, recalled only that it had been brought in by a woman with a faint accent, who seemed eager to part with it quickly, and with little fuss. Miss Marple purchased the piece, without hesitation. Back in her parlor, she studied the names. Ellalinina was not unfamiliar. Hope, however, was new. Yet something about the pairing tugged at memory. 2 names bound together, hidden in plain sight. And if the girl calling herself Deline was not Hope, then where, Miss Marple wondered, had the real Hope gone? The rose, of course, remained the key. Miss Marple had quietly sent a few petals, gathered before the constable had cordoned off the greenhouse, by post to a long-trusted acquaintance in Wiltshire, Professor Julian Trallion, a botanist known for his particular expertise in antique and hybrid roses. His reply, folded neatly in cream stationery, arrived with the week's delivery. The specimen you enclosed is almost certainly a variant of Rosa albus mirabilis, a rare French hybrid developed during the 1930s in a private conservatory near Avenue. It was never distributed commercially and is known only to exist in 2 locations, one being a cloistered convent in Provence. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The bloom found in Felicity's garden had not survived 10 winters by miracle. It had been introduced recently by someone with access to a source known only to a few. She thought again of Delphi's tremor when the rose was mentioned, of her gloved hands, of the way her eyes flinched at the word Provence. And suddenly the chain began to form, names hidden in lockets, children absent from photographs, letters buried in ash, and roses blooming in defiance of season. This was no village legend revived by weather. It was a message planted by the past, waiting for the right eyes to read it. And Miss Marple, ever patient, understood now that the garden was not just witness to secrets. It had been chosen as their guardian. Miss Marple did not act often on instinct alone, but when she did, it was generally with quiet resolve. The white rose had troubled her from the beginning, not merely for its timing or rarity, but for the precision with which it had appeared, not seeded by birds, nor tossed by wind, but planted with intention. The spot, too, had meaning. It was the same earth on which Felicity Blackmore had collapsed. Such things were never accidental. She returned to the Blackmore grounds just after sunrise, when frost still clung to branch and bramble, and the air was thick with the hush of early morning. She did not alert anyone. She brought no company, only a spade, borrowed discreetly from her gardener, and her sturdy gloves, long lined with wool and memory. The rose stood proud above the soil, undisturbed, as if daring her to touch it. She began not with haste, but with reverence, removing the loose top soil, brushing aside roots, digging where roots grew oddly thin. At precisely the depth one might conceal a keepsake, or a confession, her spade struck something that resisted. It was not stone. She knelt and cleared the space with her hands. Beneath the layers of earth lay a tin box, small and rusted, sealed with wax at its edges, and marked with the faint impression of initials. F.B. Miss Marple exhaled softly. The rose had not been planted over a grave, but over a message, and now she thought it was time for someone to listen. The box, once unearthed, gave off the scent of old metal and damp paper, but the wax seal had held. Its contents were folded precisely, protected from time, and wrought with layers of oil skin and a small satch of dried herbs, still faintly aromatic with lavender. Miss Marple, her gloves carefully removed, unfolded each document with deliberate fingers. The first item was a birth certificate, aged but official. The second, longer and heavier in legal weight, was a will, signed and witnessed in the tidy script she remembered from Felicity's correspondence. Her eyes scanned the parchment, absorbing the names and language. The original will, the one that had been mysteriously lost, had indeed been replaced, though never registered. This second document, written scarcely a month before Felicity's death, nullified the former and named a new heir. The language was firm, almost defiant. It left the entirety of the Blackmore estate to one Hope Evelina Blackmore and disinherited Lewis, in full, with only the vaguest reference to acts of betrayal no longer fit for public reckoning. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The solicitor had never seen this document, and the original, it now appeared, had not been misplaced, but deliberately replaced. She turned back to the birth certificate, her breath catching at the alignment of names, dates, and initials. It was not Lewis who had been intended to inherit this house, nor any known relative. Felicity had written this will in secret, with the same deliberate care she had once reserved for pruning her roses. The birth certificate bore a name that struck Miss Marple like the sudden bloom of truth in frost. Hope Elena Blackmore. The surname had been granted without official father. The mother was listed as Clara Hemsley, domestic servant residing at the Blackmore estate. The child had been born in secrecy. Her registration handled not through the parish office, but by post to a district in London, where inquiries would be less likely. Hope Evelina Blackmore. The name explained the locket, the initials, the letter signed E. It gave purpose to the vanishing maid, the unsmiling photograph, the girl in the shadows, and it gave context. Sharp, sudden, irrefutable context to the tremble in Miss Morrow's hands whenever roses were mentioned. Hope had not been lost. She had been hidden. Miss Marple traced the ink with a gloved finger. Felicity had known of the child. She had not only accepted her existence, she had claimed her, and someone had tried quite carefully to prevent that claim from ever reaching sunlight. The name altered everything, not because it answered all the questions, but because it confirmed that the past had not merely lingered beneath the garden soil. It had grown there, buried not in denial, but in hope. The certificate's declaration made clear what no village gossip had ever dared to confirm. Clara, the loyal maid who had disappeared without trace, had not left suddenly out of fear or theft, but to protect her child. Conceived, it now appeared within the walls of the Blackmore household, and under circumstances neither noble nor kind. The name of the father did not appear on the birth record, but Miss Marple no longer needed it to. The timeline, the signature on the false will, and the quiet scandals of the past converged neatly around one conclusion. The father had been Felicity's brother, Lewis Blackmore's own father. The affair, then, had not been mere impropriety, but incestuous betrayal of trust within the household itself. Whether seduction or coercion, Clara had borne the consequence alone. Felicity, once informed, had kept the secret, not out of shame, but Miss Marple suspected, out of fierce and private loyalty. Clara's sudden departure had not been escape, but exile, arranged to preserve the child's safety and the family's reputation in equal measure. Felicity had sent them away, perhaps to France, perhaps to the very convent that cultivated roses, which bloomed even in winter. She had done so quietly, and then altered her will in the dark. The old gardener, Mr. Sims, must have known. It explained his fierce silence, his collapse at the sight of the rose, the whisper he'd given the moment before he died. She said it would return, and so it had. Not just the flower, but the child. The document Miss Marple now held bore the unmistakable marks of legitimacy. It was dated, witnessed by 2 former tenants of the Blackmore estate, both since passed, and sealed in Felicity's hand with the faded stamp of the family crest. It left no room for doubt. Hope Evelina Blackmore was to inherit everything: house, land, titles, and holdings. The language was firm, the reasoning left unspoken, as if Felicity had trusted time to vindicate her choice, and yet the will had never surfaced. The solicitor had never been shown it. Instead, the Old Testament favoring Lewis had been left to linger until its disappearance, no doubt arranged by the same hand that had fanned the flames in the hearth and brought poison to the greenhouse. Miss Marple could see it now, the impostor heir returning at just the right time, seeking to claim what was never his, supported by a claim no one had the means to challenge. But Felicity, ever cautious, had buried the truth with a gardener's foresight, wrapped it in oilskin beneath the roots of a rose that would one day bloom again, even in winter. The symbolism had not been lost on Miss Marple. Where others left behind ledgers or confessions, Felicity had left a garden, and in it the truth had taken root. It was not buried out of fear. It was planted, knowing that one day someone with the patience to listen to flowers would uncover it. When Miss Marple returned to the house the following morning, she requested a private word with the young woman known as Deline Morrow. The girl, pale and composed, agreed with neither surprise nor hesitation. What passed between them was not accusation, but confirmation. Miss Marple did not ask if her name was truly Deline. She addressed her as Hope, and the girl's eyes, wide with recognition, did not deny it. She had returned under a false identity, not to deceive, but to understand, to search the house for what she suspected had once been meant for her. She had grown up in France, raised in quiet cloisters, with only the faintest hints of her origin, a locket, a name, and a photograph too painful to trust. She had not known whether the rumors were real or merely the dreams of a child cast away. When Louis arrived at the convent with papers and promises, she believed him. But the rose, impossible, untimely, had told her otherwise. She had returned as a stranger, but the garden had known her. And now, so did Miss Marple. Hope Evelina Blackmore had come home, and the house, long denied her, would not remain silent much longer. It was, in the end, the smallest detail that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, the rhythm of a signature. The man, calling himself Louis Blackmore, had signed a guest book at the vicarage, with an elegant but unfamiliar hand. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had once seen the real Louis's handwriting, cramped with a noticeable loop in the K, and prone to heavy pressure. This hand, by contrast, was careful, deliberate, the writing of someone trying not to be caught out by familiarity. Her doubts, though long held, were at last certain. He was not Louis, her distant cousin, she recalled. George Blackmore's son by his second wife had gone abroad after the war and been rumored to have died in Tangier, but there had been whispers that he had resurfaced later under an assumed name in Gibraltar, seeking opportunity after the loss of a title that would never be his. Now in St. Mary-me, he had taken the name of a man already dead, quietly, effectively, and with the kind of precision only possible if one had been watching from afar. He had arrived with forged papers, a foreign fiancé, and charm finally balanced on caution, and no one had questioned it. No one but Miss Marple. Now, as she compared signatures and recollections, she understood. The man they called Louis had never stood at Felicity's graveside because he had never truly known her. He had simply been waiting for the house, for the death, for the garden to fall quiet. Miss Marple had always believed that the most enduring motives were the simplest: love, fear, and inheritance. In this case, it was the latter, unvarnished and sharpened by the knowledge that time was running out. The real Louis Blackmore had died years ago in Spain, his body unclaimed, his papers lost in a conflict that buried more than just soldiers, but news travels in certain circles. The man who now posed as him had learned of this death, not by chance, but by design. He had been listening. With Louis gone and no formal death certificate issued, a gap had opened in the legal line of succession. If Felicity Blackmore's will named no other heir, the estate would default to the next surviving male relative, and that with a little fabrication could be him. He had waited until the charitable trust dissolved, until the house fell into disuse, and until Felicity's name was spoken less and less in the village lanes. He had returned at the moment when no one could challenge him, and when the evidence of rightful inheritance had been long buried. The engagement to Hope, he had believed, would seal the claim. It would silence her questions, distract her suspicions, and bind her to the house through illusion, not affection. But Hope had not been as passive as he supposed. She had recognized something in the rose, and Miss Marple, with her quiet observations and long memory, had recognized something in him. A predator cloaked in mourning. Mr. Sims, long dismissed as a simple gardener, had in fact been the final sentinel of a buried truth. Felicity Blackmore, knowing that time was against her, and mistrusting solicitors who bowed too easily to convention, had entrusted the will not to law, but to earth. She had asked Sims to hide it, specifically beneath the white rose bush that had always been her pride. She chose that spot not merely for sentiment, but for protection. Beneath what's living, she had once said to the vicer's wife. Now the words made sense. Sims had kept the secret with quiet devotion, resisting temptation, fear, and the long arm of silence. Even when the house stood empty and whispers arose about ghostly blooms and strange inheritances, he had said nothing. His loyalty had not been to a name, but to a memory, and to a promise made beneath fading sunlight. But when the impostor arrived, bearing the face of a man long dead, and the name of one who never returned, Sims must have known the secret was in danger. Perhaps he went to the garden to retrieve the box. Perhaps he intended to tell someone, Hope, or the vicar, or even MissMarple. Instead, he had been silenced, not brutally, but efficiently. A dose masked in tea or tonic, or perhaps the very rose-water extract Felicity once stored beneath the potting bench. Sims had held the truth as long as he could. Now, MissMarple would carry it the rest of the way. Felicity had understood better than most what silence cost, and what danger lay in truth unprotected. When she discovered her maid's condition, and the name of the man responsible, she had not cast Clara out in shame. She had arranged instead for quiet passage to France through a convent she had once visited in Provence, where the child could be raised with peace and distance. It had not been cowardice. It had been strategy. She knew what her brother would do to preserve the Blackmore name, and she knew that the only safety for the child lay far from St. Mary, far from suspicion and scandal, in a place where truth could sleep quietly under veils and prayer. Hope had grown up with only fragments, a locket, a story half told, and the rarest of roses growing in a cloistered garden. Felicity had kept contact through letters, sometimes sent under assumed names, always careful. She had intended one day to bring Hope back properly. But death came first, so she wrote a new will, and she left it where only a gardener or a girl who knew how to look might find it. The child had not been abandoned. She had been preserved like the seed of a flower meant to bloom out of season. The rose, its color, its fragrance, its very improbability, had always been more than a curiosity. It was a message, precise and botanical, sent from a past that had never truly left. MissMarple had consulted the botanist, of course, but she had also asked Hope softly without intrusion where she had first seen such a bloom. The girl had hesitated only a moment before replying. At the convent they grow beside the fountain. It was no ordinary rose. The Rosa albus mirabilis, bred in secrecy by an elderly French gardener, was unknown to commerce. Its petals could survive a frost. Its roots took deep hold, resisting upheaval. It bloomed improbably when other things died. MissMarple remembered the locket, the pressed petals inside. They had not come from Blackmore at all, but from France, from a garden where Felicity's love had taken root, not in scandal, but in redemption. The pendant, now worn openly by Hope, matched the initials in the scorched letter. Ellalinina, Clara's second name. Hope, the child. The rose had returned, not by miracle, but by memory. Someone had brought the cutting from the convent and planted it here. Not the impostor. He would not have known its name. But Hope. She had recognized the soil. She had understood the garden. And in planting that rose, she had awakened everything Felicity meant to protect. The flower was not just a symbol. It was a key, and it had unlocked what deception tried to seal. When MissMarple returned to Blackmore House once more, she did not come alone. She had asked quietly for the solicitor, for Hope, and for the vicar. The impostor stood near the fireplace, composed, but paler than usual. He had been watching her more closely of late, measuring her silences, searching her expressions for signs of danger. Now, as she laid out the contents of the tin box, the forged identity unraveled without a word of protest. He did not deny it. He did not even flinch. Instead, he looked at the will, then at Hope, and then at the rose visible through the tall windows now dusted with snow. "She shouldn't have come back," he said softly. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was fear, because he had believed truly that the past would remain dead, that papers could be burned and Gardner silenced, and a frightened girl manipulated into silence. But the garden had spoken, and MissMarple, who had never needed violence to reveal a crime, simply folded her hands and turned toward the visor. There was no scene, no confession shouted into the air, only a quiet nod and the final realization that everything he had planted had bloomed. Just not for him. The conservatory, warmed by the weak winter sun and softened by the scent of camellias, provided the unlikely setting for what would become, in years to come, the most talked-about afternoon in St. Mary, Maine. Tea had been served. Scones, both plain and currant, sat untouched on the tiered stand. The vicar, Mr. Pendlebury, Hope, and the man still addressed as Lewis sat in cautious silence, and Miss Marple, calm but precise, prepared to speak. She began not with accusation, but with gratitude for the company, for the patience, and for the decency of a village that understood the difference between scandal and justice. Then, with characteristic modesty, she unfolded the tale. She spoke of a rose that should not have bloomed, of a gardener who died holding its petals, of a second will buried not in secrecy, but in faith. She described a locket passed through hands uncertain of its worth, a convent garden in France, and a child raised far from the name that should have been hers. Her voice did not rise. She offered no drama, only clarity. As she laid out the sequence of facts, it became apparent to all that this was not a tale of confusion, but of careful deception. Her crime measured not in moments, but in years. And when she finally looked at the man seated to her left, her expression did not accuse. It merely awaited recognition, because by now there was nothing left for him to deny, only the reckoning. Miss Marple's eyes settled gently upon him as she reached for a slip of paper from her handbag. It was a copy of the parish register dated 15 years prior, listing the baptism of Louis George Blackmore. Beneath it, she placed another document, the death record, issued quietly by Spanish authorities during the final years of the Civil War. The body had been identified by military insignia and belongings, not by family. The real Louis, she said calmly, had died abroad. His passing had never been widely known, and without official British confirmation, his name had lingered in legal ambiguity. The man now seated before her, who had returned to claim the Blackmore estate, had known this. A second cousin, she explained, once removed and long estranged, had learned of Louis's death and assumed the identity, carrying forged documents and wearing a history that no one had cause to doubt. He said nothing, though his knuckles whitened around his teacup. Miss Marple continued. His plan had been remarkably sound. Return at the appropriate hour, declare legal right, and marry the girl he believed too timid to investigate her own past. But there was one variable he had not considered, a flower, not one placed in a bouquet, but planted in remembrance, a rose with roots deeper than paperwork and petals delicate enough to undo a lie. She folded the documents neatly again, and in that moment the man's silence became admission. Miss Marple turned then to the memory of Mr. Sims, not with solemnity, but with a gentle respect reserved for those who serve quietly, and are too often forgotten. He had been more than a gardener. He had been, in the end, a custodian of truth. It was Felicity Blackmore, knowing the fragility of her position and the growing threat of the man who claimed kinship, who entrusted Sims with a second will. But knowing such a document, if discovered prematurely, would be destroyed. She had given him a second instruction to plant the rose, a rare hybrid known only to a French convent garden, upon the box where the will was buried. Sims had obeyed, not out of fear, but devotion. He had waited year after year through seasons of neglect and whispers of ghosts for the right moment. When hope returned, cloaked in the name of a stranger, and when the rose bloomed unseasonably upon her arrival, he understood the time had come. The girl had found her way home. He had gone to retrieve the box, but had not lived to speak. Miss Marple's voice softened as she finished. He left no note, because he trusted the rose to speak. And it had, not to the man who coveted the garden, but to the one it had been planted for. Hope's eyes welled, not with confusion, but with understanding. Mr. Sims had not died forgotten. He had died fulfilling his promise. There remained, of course, the matter of Mr. Sims's death, so quickly ruled natural by a doctor fatigued by winter and eager for finality. But Miss Marple had long suspected otherwise. She recounted the evidence simply: the missing bottle from Felicity's cabinet, the bitter scent reported by the maid, and the deliberate arrangement of petals in the gardener's clenched hand. The poison had not been administered recklessly. It had been prepared and dosed with calculation. Its effects mimic cardiac failure almost perfectly, but the apothecary had confirmed its telltale bitterness, a taste no man would consume willingly. Sims, she suggested, had intended to unearth the will. Perhaps he had hinted too clearly. Perhaps he had trusted the wrong listener. The impostor, realizing the gardener's knowledge posed a threat, had acted swiftly. A tea, a tonic, a gesture of thanks, all plausible. But it was the rose that betrayed him. Had he known its origin, he might have hesitated. Instead, he underestimated the power of symbols rooted in memory. MissMarple paused. Sims had died with petals in hand, not to accuse, but to direct. And someone had panicked, not because they lacked cruelty, but because they lacked imagination. At last, MissMarple turned to the girl, who had remained quiet through her most of the revelation. Pope Evelina Blackmore, once Deline Morrow, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed but quietly strained. MissMarple addressed her with warmth, not pity. She spoke of Clara, the loyal maid, whose disappearance had never been explained. She spoke of Felicity, who had hidden her shame not in silence, but in a convent garden across the channel. She described the journey of a child given a name she never understood, and a past she could never confirm until the rose bloomed and whispered what no voice had dared speak aloud. Then she produced the will. The names were clear, the dates unchallengeable. The estate, Blackmore House, the lands and the holdings had been left not to the son of Felicity's brother, but to the child born of his betrayal. The language was both legal and protective to Hope Evelina Blackmore, that she may possess what others tried to erase. Hope looked not at the paper, but at the woman who had shown her the path. She had come seeking memory, and found truth. She had been a visitor in her own inheritance. Now, by Felicity's hand and Mr. Sims's sacrifice, she was no longer a stranger. She was home. The man did not protest as he was escorted from the house. He offered no parting glance, no false apology. The silence, as he left, was neither mournful nor triumphant. It was merely final. MissMarple, however, remained behind. Hope joined her in the garden, where frost had begun to lift from the soil, and the white rose stood untouched. At MissMarple's request, she bent beside the base of the plant, brushing away a light scattering of leaves. There, entwined within the lowest roots, lay a thin silver chain, tarnished, but intact a locket, aged and worn, bearing two names faintly inscribed, Eleanor and Hope. The girl's breath caught, but she did not cry. She simply lifted the pendant and fastened it at her throat, as though restoring something that had been taken far too soon. MissMarple said nothing. There was nothing to add. Justice had not thundered. It had not punished loudly or praised lavishly. It had arrived gently with the bloom of a winter rose, the unearthing of a box, and the quiet return of a name long buried, as the first snowdrop pierced the cold earth nearby. MissMarple glanced upward. Spring, it seemed, had come early after all. Spring arrived early in St. Mary-Me that year, not with fanfare, but with a kind of tentative softness, like a guest long delayed and uncertain of her welcome. The frost retreated modestly from the hedgerows. Crocuses emerged in quiet defiance, and in the garden behind Blackmore House, the white rose continued to bloom with unwavering grace, its petals unbowed by the season's shifting air. Villagers noticed, of course, they always did, but where once there had been suspicion and hushed speculation, now there was a kind of reverent acceptance. The story had passed, as stories in villages do, from scandal to parable, and finally to peace. Children returning from school paused by the low stone wall to glance inwards. Mrs. Wetherill remarked that roses had always been peculiar in their timing, especially when sentiment lingered in the soil. The house itself no longer appeared abandoned. Curtains stirred. A chimney smoked gently in the afternoon. Life, where once there had been only memory, had begun again. MissMarple, observing these small shifts from her parlor window, smiled faintly, not because all wounds had healed, but because the ground had softened. The garden, long silenced, had spoken, and the village at last had begun to listen. It might have been expected by those who know little of roots and less of memory that Hope would leave. She had, after all, Every reason, the deception, the grief, the fear of never truly belonging. But some inheritances cannot be refused, and some names are not merely claimed. They are lived. Hope remained. She did not do so in triumph, nor with any great proclamation. Rather, she stayed in the manner of one completing a circle. The house, once shuttered against time, now breathed quietly around her. She moved through its rooms, with the tentative care of someone reacquainting herself with something lost too early. It was she who suggested that the house be opened, not for visitors or guests, but for children. War orphans, some from France, some from London, would be given warmth, garden, and silence enough to begin again. The idea was met with ready approval. Mr. Pendlebury handled the paperwork. The vicar offered support. Miss Marple, when asked, simply said it was a most suitable continuation of the house's purpose. And so Blackmore House, once the stage for silence and deceit, became something gentler, her sanctuary not just of brick and blossom, but of renewal. Hope had returned not to reclaim property. She had returned to fulfill a promise, made before she could speak. Miss Marple resumed her knitting in the weeks that followed. It was a shawl this time, pale lavender wool, with a stitch that required moderate attention, but allowed room for thought. Her fingers worked automatically, each loop a meditation. She did not consider herself heroic, nor particularly clever. It had simply been a matter of observation, of listening when others dismissed, of remembering what others forgot. A rose blooming in winter, a girl's hand trembling, a gardener's collapse, nothing more. Yet she thought often of Felicity Blackmore, not as a victim, but as a woman who had chosen a quiet form of defiance, who had loved deeply and protected fiercely, and who had trusted nature to do what law could not. She thought too of Sims, of how some men carried truth not in their mouths, but in their hands, buried beneath soil and frost. Gardens, Miss Marple reflected, were rather like truth itself. One could delay their bloom, one could cover them in stone, but given time and the right light, they always returned. She looked out her window as the white rose bowed faintly in the breeze. It had waited patiently, and like all things that endure, it had been heard. The letter came one morning, postmarked in Provence. The handwriting was delicate, the paper faintly scented with something floral and old. Hope brought it to Miss Marple personally, her expression unreadable. Inside the note was brief. The sisters at the convent had always known, or rather, they had always suspected. Felicity's visits had not gone unnoticed. The child left in their care had carried too many echoes of the woman who had come before her. But no questions had been asked, only prayers offered, and a small space in the garden given to rose cutings that no other child was permitted to touch. We waited. The letter read, "Not for answers, but for a sign. The rose you planted has bloomed every winter since." It bore no signature. Miss Marple read it once and folded it neatly. There was nothing to return, no explanation to offer. The letter had not been sent to inform, but to affirm that memory, even when buried, had not faded, that others too had guarded the truth in silence, and that sometimes justice is a thing arranged in advance by women who may never meet, but who understand one another perfectly, a letter of finality, and of quiet triumph. That afternoon, Miss Marple stood once more before the rose. It had lost some of its winter intensity, its petals beginning to loosen, its stem less defiant in the warming air, but it stood, still blooming. She regarded it without sentimentality. It had begun, after all, not with murder, but with a flower, and it had ended, not with a confession, but with a truth that could no longer be hidden. She thought of Clara, of Felicity, of Sims, of Hope, who had returned without knowing why she had been called home, and of the man who had believed names could be worn like coats. Justice had not been swift, nor had it shouted. It had unfolded petal by petal, clue by clue, until what was planted in silence had finally broken through. Miss Marple reached out and gently touched one of the outermost blooms. It quivered but did not fall. In winter, she murmured almost to herself, "All things sleep, but not all forget." She turned back to the path, her knitting waiting by the fireside, her tea growing cold. The village would carry on, but the garden would remember, and that Miss Marple knew was quite enough. And so, with spring returning to St. Mary, and the white rose in full bloom, justice has found its way home. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but with the soft persistence of truth. Miss Marple once said that gardens know everything. They simply wait. And in this case, they waited long enough for a child to return, for lies to wither, and for memory to blossom into something far stronger than silence. This wasn't merely a tale of inheritance or deception. It was a story about identity, how it can be stolen, buried, or forgotten, but never truly erased. Hope's quiet strength reminded us that sometimes the most fragile people carry the deepest roots, and the rarest rose, like the rarest justice, often grows where no one expects.